Hello and welcome to another edition of Off to Tube AP European History. It is fantastic to be broadcasting to each and every one of you. And today we're going to be looking at our next kind of development in European history. Again, we've been looking at this time period from 1648 to 1850. And this is a time period that really sees two what seemingly parallel developments are going to be happening in Europe, but what are actually going to be on a major collision course. We started out looking at this time period by studying those absolutist monarchs and the growth of centralized authority in European states, and really kind of the development of and the creation of these solidified major power states of Europe. And these rulers are not only going to be taking more political power and power of the legal system, but they're going to be taking more economic power through mercantilism. They're going to be taking cultural power by designating which religion, Protestant or Catholic, their state is going to be worshiping. And in fact, though, many times be naming priests and controlling the church and making the church a state-run institution. You see, again, these rulers taking social control over their nobility. I mean, literally, like we talked about Louis, having his nobility come and live in his house and keeping them busy competing over who gets to dress him in the morning or take out his chamber pot in the evening, rather than plotting against him and limiting his power. And so, at the same time, though, while monarchies are gaining more and more power, you also see two intellectual movements happening that's going to begin to challenge traditional authority in general, not just political authority under these absolutist monarchs. And that's the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. Both are going to be tearing down the rule of the church and the influence that the church has both in society and in politics, but the Enlightenment is going to directly challenge the way that the entire system of Europe is set up. I mean, not just challenging whether or not a king or a queen in a monarchy is a natural form of government, but also looking at the social structure of Europe. Should there be equality amongst all people? Does it make sense that such a privileged few live this life of luxury while the majority of people are eking out a subsistence living? And so the Enlightenment is a major event for European history. And as we see the time period moving on and we get into the 18th century, a really interesting thing happens is that you start to see these next wave of absolutist rulers begin to learn about the Enlightenment. I mean, they are studying, in some cases, they are inviting people like Voltaire and Rousseau to come to court and talk to them about their ideas. And you start to see absolutist monarchs begin to apply some Enlightenment values to the way that they rule. And so the 18th century is where we start to see a shift in politics, where Enlightenment values are starting to be implemented in Europe. But of course, they're only going to be implemented to a point, because these rulers will always be absolutist when it comes down to it. I mean, when push comes to shove, when their rule is questioned, they have no problem ordering the immediate and untimely death of anybody who goes against them. These individuals are known as enlightened despots or enlightened absolutists. And so chapter 18 goes through a variety of these enlightened absolutists. So what I wanted to do today is start to look at what it means to be an enlightened absolutist and an enlightened despot, how that was practiced, and then look at a bit of the shifts on how Europeans saw the role of politics. Now, when I say Europeans, of course, I'm talking about how political theorists and those who were involved in politics saw it. The average peasant is still trying not to die of some sort of pox. But when we look at absolute rule, again, it's going to be one of those things where we see the Enlightenment making a difference, but the Enlightenment still has not come to a full fruition yet, because our time period is going to end in the second part of this week, which is going to be the French Revolution. So ultimately, you have to understand that these enlightened despots are not going to do enough to stop revolution from occurring. Enlightened they may be, but still despots when it comes down to it. So let's get into just the little mini lecture that we have here, and then we'll get into our first supplemental assignment. So, ladies and gentlemen, enlightened absolutism. I think it's a great way of looking at it is a quote by one of the greatest of the absolute enlightened absolutists, and that's Frederick the Great of Prussia, Oh, Frederick! All he wanted to do was play his lute and go and run off with his boyfriend until his father found out about it and had his boyfriend executed and forced his son to watch it. Um, but either way, he wound up becoming a great ruler for Prussia. But if he be the first general, the first minister of the realm, he is only the first servant of the state. I want you to see that quote. He is only the first servant of the state. What that means is that absolutist rulers are going to see the reason for their power to change. Louis XIV and other absolutist monarchs said, L'état c'est moi, I am the state. I mean, all power emanated from their own personal, in Louis's case, holy being. These enlightened despots are going to change that. And they're going to change and say that their power is based on their usefulness to the state. This is known as the reason of state. Rulers are going to base their decisions based off of whatever is the most reasonable outcome to maintain stability for their state. That doesn't mean maintaining stability necessarily for their family, their dynasty. It doesn't mean these petty differences for them as an individual. To be an enlightened monarch is to be one that sees that their role is to first serve the state. Now again, how does this get practiced? Well, the first way that they're going to do that is they're going to increase their military, but they're also going to use diplomacy. We've seen this as kind of a general trend in European history. The size of militaries are going to continue to grow, well, until we see Europe exploding and imploding and generally trying to tear itself apart through World War I. And so they are going to be increasing their military. You saw that happening with Louis XIV and rulers like Peter the Great. That's going to continue under all of these monarchs as well. Catherine the Great is going to be expanding Russia. She's going to be fighting the Turks. She's going to be taking more control over the Crimea. Catherine is certainly going to use the military. Prussia, well, there is no Prussia unless there's a military. So again, they're going to increase the military, but as we're going to see in a bit, they're also going to try to use diplomacy when they can. And what becomes incredibly important for rulers during this time period is maintaining the balance of power. Again, as we get further away from the Middle Ages, these different European states are going to become more solidified. There's going to be less changes in boundaries. There's going to be less. There's going to be less moving around of the map. There's still going to be some, but there's less of it happening. And so the rulers that are there are going to begin to, in some senses, work together to ensure that no one power gets more than the other, essentially saying that the way that things are is a good balance of power. And so they're going to watch each other and each other's movements, and instead of just getting into dynastic struggles or getting into fights over specific territory, they may join a war simply because they don't want Russia to get more power. And that's the idea of this reason of the state. However, it's not all just about maintaining political power. It's also some of those Enlightenment values that philosophers like John Locke and Rousseau and Voltaire and Beccaria are all promoting in their writings. It's the protection of individual freedoms, granting the freedom of speech, the freedom of press, in some cases even the freedom of religion within their territories. And some are going to go as far as to even uphold equality under the law. You mean the nobility don't have special freedoms? My goodness, that is dangerous for the state. But either way, this is something that some of them are going to do. These enlightened absolutists are also going to be fostering the arts and sciences. Like I said, most of them are going to be inviting Enlightenment philosophers to come stay with them at court. Frederick the Great, like I said, he was a musician at heart. That's what he wanted to do. So he believed that arts and sciences were something that should be maintained. Now, again, it has to be said, similarly to absolutist monarchs, these enlightened despots are also going to be fostering the science, not just because progress. No, they're going to be fostering the sciences because they want to gain more control over their territory. If there's a better understanding of how the way the world works, maybe they can control things a little bit better. However, again, these are enlightened absolutists. So above all, any change that happens in their territory has to come from the top down. It is not a a source of popular revolution. And a great example of that is when the crazy peasant Pugachev stages a massive revolt in Russia, and Catherine the Great brutally suppresses it and puts it down. Again, change comes from the top, change does not come from the bottom. And to kind of give you just an example of this, and looking at sort of ways that these enlightened despots were using this reason of state to judge their decisions. We look at some of the quote-unquote practical wars of the 18th century. I mean, obviously, it's an oxymoron to use the word practical wars, because wars is where incredible amounts of waste happen, obviously in lives, but also in resources as well. So wars aren't really ever practical, but neither here nor there. And one of the first practical wars of the 18th century is the War of Austrian Succession. So what causes this war to happen? Well, the first is the fact that there is no heir to the Austrian throne. And so what is the question that happens? Well, there is this pragmatic sanction that the Austrians try to put in, saying, well, Maria Theresa, a woman, is going to be the heir. Now, of course, this is going to be a fairly shocking thing for Europeans, and for some, it's going to be seen as an opportunity to gain some territory, some land, some resources for themselves. For example, Prussia. Prussia wants Silesia, and you can see Silesia, this little sliver of land here in northern Austria / what is now Germany, and they want that territory, and so they see this as an opportunity to challenge a female monarch and try and take some power, because their question is to what degree is her rule actually legitimate? And France, on the other hand, is not even necessarily looking for territory. They just want to harm the Habsburgs. I mean, again, the Habsburgs are in Spain and they're in Austria. They're surrounding France. So a weak Austrian empire is going to, Habsburg's empire is going to certainly be a good thing for France. Oh yeah, and when the British join in to help the Austrians, the French also want to gain more territory in India and the Americas. So there's also that. And then, of course, England. Why do they really care about this Austrian war? Well, they don't want to see France getting more powerful. So you see these reasons of state. These are not necessarily dynastic struggles where the King of France is claiming to be the seventh cousin of the Duke of Austria and therefore is claiming to have legitimacy. It's simply, this is what's best for our state now. And of course, you then have the end treaty at Aix-la-Chapelle, because really the war winds up coming to absolutely nothing, and Silesia is the only thing that eventually then gets into Prussian territory. The second of those practical wars is going to be the 7 Years' War, otherwise known as the First World War. Again, a war that is, sure, fought between these European states, but the majority of the war isn't even really fought in Europe. The majority of the war is actually fought elsewhere around in the Caribbean, in North America. That's known as the French and Indian War, for those of you that are in APUS, and then is actually fought in actual India as well. And again, it's not a war over gaining things politically within Europe. It's a war over resources and whose empire is going to be dominant. And so that's just an example of this reasons of state. And I wanted to define absolute Enlightened Absolutism, because that's going to largely be the focus of your presentations this week. And I wanted to give you guys some things to then go off of as you are studying the extent to which these rulers did. And of course, when we look at extent, the one that I have to go back to is poor Joseph II of Austria. I mean, poor Joey. The guy tried. He really did. He really tried to put the most enlightened reforms into his country, but each and every one of them wind up getting just undermined by the nobility who don't want to see that change happening. And so on his tombstone, it says, "Here lies Joseph II, a man who failed at all he undertook." Poor guy. That's got to be the most depressing tombstone I have ever heard of. I mean, goodness gracious. Not only do we see shifts happening politically within the 18th century in Europe, we also see some economic shifts. And that's really going to be what our supplemental assignment is about. Because in 18th century, historians really debate whether or not there was a consumer revolution during this time period. And so there's this period of economic upturn. that we see happening in the 18th century. In most places, except for places like France that was going through some struggles of their own, but in most places, you see the economies beginning to boom in the 18th century. So, what's the reason for that? Well, number one is there's relative stability after the end of the 30 Years' War. Yes, you're having these little wars of Austrian succession. The 7 Years' War, I guess, isn't a very little war, but it's mostly fought overseas. So there's this sense of relative stability. With more stability, that means trade and things are going to be much more active. There's a decrease in the death rate. There's a couple of reasons for that. One, some of the innovations of the scientific revolution are going to lead to advances in medicine and better health care. At the same time, you also see a decrease in the death rate, largely because of the importation of foods from the Americas. Calorie-rich foods like potatoes are going to be entered into European diets and therefore allow for more people to live. You also see, just not even because of food coming from the Americas, you're also going to see improvements in agriculture. In 1750, Britain especially, but it's going to happen in some other places in Western Europe, you're going to see an agricultural revolution where Europeans are going to begin to learn more about farming practices and start to apply certain innovations in order to make farming more productive. For example, it used to be a 3-field system. They go into I think it's a 4-field system that eventually goes into crop rotation. And instead of simply leaving one of those fields fallow for a bit, just empty, they're going to start planting nitrogen-rich plants, which I know is redundant, but they're going to be planting nitrogen-rich plants like alfalfa, which is going to return the nutrients to the soil much faster, which allows for more crops to then be grown. There's also technological innovations that are going to be developed during the agricultural revolution. There's going to be a plow and seed planter that does 2 things at once. And then you're even going to see some scientific practices being added into things like raising animals. I actually love looking at pictures of the agricultural revolution because you see these pictures of farm animals that are being raised for fairs. This is when raising you would submit your animals for fairs, and the person with the largest pig would win. And you see these images of pigs. Well, they're etchings, obviously not pictures, but you see these etchings of pigs that literally look like squares on 2 little stubby legs, or obviously 4 stubby legs, but they on these little stubby legs because they were figuring out how to grow these massive animals. So there was just in general more food available as well. And then, of course, another reason for a consumer revolution, the fact that people could be buying more luxury goods, is wealth continuing to pour in from the colonies, not only from the colonies in the Americas, but also the colonies in the Indian Ocean as well. Trade from India, especially as the British and the French are making inroads into India. So you see cheap raw materials, you see these guaranteed markets. And then you also see improvements in banking, and especially with big, massive banks like the Bank of England, and the use of bank notes and almost paper money that's going to make the transfer of capital much, much easier. And these are all things that are going to lead to a consumer revolution, where Europeans are going to be buying luxury items. Now, when I say luxury items, I mean literally things that we would even take for granted. Silverware, for one, is going to be something that more Europeans are going to buy. For more of the wealthy, of course, my favorite innovations from the early modern and modern era of European history is the importation of coffee and tea and chocolate from the colonies and from the Ottoman Empire. I mean, this is the time when coffee houses become an incredibly important institution in European society. In fact, it's one of the reasons for the spread of Enlightenment values, is people were reading and sharing ideas at these coffee houses, just drinking their coffee like every good human does. So today's investigation is going to be another DBQ, and you are going to be looking at a set of documents that I have shared with you from that book, from Wisner's book again. And you're going to be looking at these documents and responding to the question that you see here. I'm going to give you the set of documents, and you're going to be analyzing the extent to which there was a consumer revolution for Europeans from 1700 to 1900. I'm actually going to change that date to say from 1600 to 1900. And so, again, anytime you see a prompt like this, you want to break it down. Analyze means to put it into pieces, our different themes of AP European history. Anytime you see the phrase the extent, you want to think somewhat or mostly. So depending on whatever the topic is, you want to then think somewhat or mostly. So analyze the extent to which there was a consumer revolution for Europeans from 1600 to 19. So we want to know, was there mostly a consumer revolution, or was there only somewhat a consumer revolution? And we'll be kind of using different arguments to break that down. Now, with these documents that I'm going to show you in just a little bit, they're a little bit different. Most of these documents are actually going to be visual documents. They're going to be etchings, they're going to be charts and graphs, so they're not going to have as much reading involved per se. And so because of that, I'm going to kind of combine some of these documents into one set for you. So you can see I've done that here. So documents 1 through 3 and document 6, in my mind, are all kind of just one document. I want you to kind of look through all of them, but put them together in your mind. And so as you're looking at these documents, of course, one of the biggest things is, how do these documents answer the question? So you can see I've given you some prompts to try to help you do that for these documents. In general, documents 1 through 3, 6, and 4, and well, actually 1 through 6, are going to be looking at the beginning. What was life like in the 17th century, and then as we get into the 18th century and the 19th century? Actually, I don't even know why. Well, I'll just do to 1900. Just keep it there. No, I don't like that. I'm going to put 1800 there. So as we look at life from the 17th through the 18th centuries, I want you to look at what was it like in the beginning first, and that's documents 1 through 6. Documents 7 through 9, again, are going to be charts and graphs, and I want you to put those together in your head as one single document. And so take all the information, put it together, and use those documents then to respond to these sorts of questions. The end documents, that's where I want you to start looking at them as individuals. And so documents 10 through 14, you're going to be looking for evidence on consumption or living standards to see, is there an increase? Is it actually a revolution? And in a lot of cases, who's it a revolution for? So let's just take a look at the documents really quickly here, as we just get a little familiar with what I'm asking you to do. So if I scroll up to the top here, you can see here's where the evidence starts. Document 1 is this image. 2 is this short little chart. 3 is a bar graph, not a bar graph. I'm doing a line graph. I could totally pass math in high school, I promise. And then documents 4 and 5 are both images. And so again, I wanted you to just see that they're not all written documents. Document 6 is another line graph. Again, you're going to see other charts. I'm sorry that some of them are sideways, so you'll have to tilt your head or your iPad or however you're going to do it. But a lot of them are statistics. So in general, then once we get to 10, you're going to see it's mostly going to be visual. I actually really love this document. We're going to look at it in just a second. But there are going to be some charts. The only written document is document 12. Please skim it. It's a witty kind of poem about what this person sees happening in Europe. So please, it's difficult to read, but do your best with it. I can also answer any questions you have on it. And then, of course, 13 and 14, again, are going to be charts. So you're going to be looking through this evidence, and you're going to be trying to figure out to what extent do we actually see consumption, a consumer revolution? Do we see people buying more things, and do we see their living standards being raised? Because this is a DBQ practice, and because we're practicing to do that DBQ, I also want you to, again, practice doing your hippo analysis. I want you to then tell me, for these documents, what's in general the historical context? If it's from the 16th century, what's going on, the 17th century, what's happening in general in the 17th century? That's absolutism, that's mercantilism, that's the growth of these overseas empires. What's the intended audience, the point of view, the purpose of these documents, and any outside information you have. I just want you to do one hippo analysis per these boxes. So you don't need to do a hippo analysis for document 1, document 2, document 3. It's documents 1 through 3 and 6 all get one hippo analysis. Documents 4 and 5, 1 hippo analysis. That's what I want you to do there. Again, part of practicing this is just, again, identifying that for now, and that's what I want you to do in this handout. The second thing that I then want you to do is whenever you write a DBQ, you start with reading the directions, breaking down the prompt, brainstorming possible answers, and then you go through and you start reading through the documents and you go around the horn, which is kind of what I'm having you do in a truncated version here. Once you've gone through all the documents, now it's time to start to put the documents together in what your argument is going to be. So you are going to find a way to group these documents in how they answer the question. So I want you to practice doing that here. So I've actually given you the answers to what you should be seeing in the documents. What the documents show about this consumer revolution is that it somewhat shows a change, or it somewhat shows a consumer revolution in the urban middle classes and the aristocracy, because they were able to purchase more luxury items. So there is somewhat a consumer revolution that happens, but it's really only for the urban middle classes and the aristocracy. Because what we also see is that there mostly isn't a revolution for the majority of people who were unable to buy, to afford more than subsistence standard of living. And so, again, the documents can be pretty much grouped into two different sections. Some that show that, well, hey, there actually was a good increase for some people, but for a majority of people like peasants, it was not. So I just want you to put the document numbers in whatever they prove. So if documents 1 through 3 and 6 help you to prove that it somewhat shows a revolution, well then go for it and put it there. If you think that maybe document 10 shows that, or actually probably a better idea is documents 4 and 5 only show that it wasn't a revolution because peasants weren't really able to afford much more than a subsistence standard of living, then you'd put just the document number there. All I want are numbers, like if 1, 3, 7, 5, I guess is what I typed there. But I just want you to practice grouping the documents so that you can see, if we were to write that essay, these would be the topic sentences of your body paragraphs, and whatever document numbers you put in here, those would be your evidence points for this paragraph. So again, I'm trying to, in teaching we call it scaffolding, but I'm trying to break down the process of writing a DBQ so you can kind of see how it would fit into an essay. And then to also help you, I want you to then choose, and I keep saying change somewhat revolution, and I'll change the grammar for this too. Somewhat revolution. Sorry, mostly, here we go. So I just want you to choose one of these documents, and I want you to use the document to prove whatever argument it is. So for the somewhat, I want you to tell me how one of those documents you put here proves this argument. For another document, I want you to show how one of the documents proves this argument. So here's my example, and obviously you can't use my example as one of yours. Document 8 proves that there was an increase in consumption, particularly in regards to luxury items such as sugar. The amount imported almost tripled from 1740 to 1790 in France, and consumption in England doubled in the same time period. Right? So I would say it's somewhat of a consumer revolution because those things happened. Notice how I cite the document by saying document 8 proves, and I've scaffolded that for you here. And then I've given a little bit of an explanation for how it proves my argument. Then I want you to also then practice writing analysis statements, because for the analysis and reasoning, you can either do an analysis statement or a synthesis statement. So for this handout, I want you to then think about, why do we see it only somewhat? Why do we see somewhat of a revolution? But why do we see it mostly not being a revolution? And so I want you to do the somewhat, why is it a revolution? And I really want you to actually think about this middle section here, because there's going to be reasons for why things are changing just by looking at these documents. So when you're doing that analysis statement, I really want you to focus on documents 7 through 9, because I think the key for why there is a consumer revolution comes from those documents. Here's my example, and I did it for what I said is the continuity, but for the mostly not a revolution. And that is, the reasons why peasants continued to live at a mostly subsistence level was because of the strict social hierarchy still present in Europe. Much of Europe was divided into three estates: the clergy, nobility, and everybody else. In places like France, much of the burden of taxation, I should say taxes, but whatever, rested on the third estate, which meant that peasants were paying 50% of their income in taxes, which also included yield revenue, which what I mean by that is crop yield revenue is what I meant to say. Because of this, they did not have a lot of expendable income to spend on things like sugar and silverware and other things that the wealthy did have more expendable income for. So these are the skills that you're practicing here. Again, we're practicing for a DBQ. So you're practicing just simply having an essay question or an essay prompt given to you, and then using documents in order to answer the question. So you're practicing figuring out how primary sources answer a question. You're practicing figuring out what the hippo is, what are some of that around the horn skills that we're doing. We're trying to figure out what the historical context, intended audience, point of view, purpose, and any outside information, right? Just being able to identify it. We're practicing grouping the documents here as if we were going to start maybe setting up an essay, and then we're practicing how we're going to actually use the documents and then provide reasoning to make our essay better. I hope you enjoy this DBQ. I think it's really interesting to really look at charts and graphs and try to put all of this together. I'm sure your math teachers are going to be absolutely thrilled that a history teacher is actually using math in order to teach content. So until next time, off it all out.